All right, welcome to another T-Rex Talk, and I have a very special guest with me. I'm going to spoil a YouTube video. I think I'm going to launch this podcast before a YouTube video that you guys can keep an eye out for. But I want to introduce you to Ethen Yazel, who is a friend of mine, and some of you may already know him through ilovemuzzleloading.com, which is a website and a YouTube channel and a podcast. And how are you doing, Ethen?
I'm doing great, Isaac. Thank you so much for having me on today.
Well, this is our second collaboration. I'm looking forward to the video. Unfortunately, you're not in the video, but a lot of items are in the video, which is very an extremely important thing to have in the video. You brought along a bunch of old, important rifles. I'm incredibly grateful to you for that. So the way that we know each other, for listeners to the podcast, is we have a mutual friend named Jordan Goodwin he has a YouTube channel called Axe and Anvil. And he put me in touch with Ethen because I was looking for somebody that had a wide panoply of vintage firearms for a particular video, which I'm kind of crossing my fingers and just hoping that by the time we launch this podcast, we have actually launched the video. There hasn't been some terrible disaster.
It will be launched. I can feel it.
It's gonna be good if you guys can watch both. So we're not gonna talk too much about the video in this particular podcast because we just don't want to cover the same ground twice. But in talking about firearm rights, which T-Rex Arms often does, we go back and we talk about historic firearms quite a bit. And in a recent podcast where we were talking to Matthew of Fudbusters, he mentioned how important some of these historical principles are from a legal perspective. Constitutional context is very important, but also because we recently had the Supreme Court decision handed down. The Bruin decision actually makes this case very clearly about the historical precedent. So in order for gun laws to be constitutional, they must, first of all, not violate Second Amendment, but they also must be compatible with gun laws of the time. So the principles of understanding what privately owned firearms were like at that time is very important from a legal perspective. But Ethen, you believe that those are important. They're important reasons to be familiar with and have an understanding of historic arms for other reasons. So why do you love muzzleloading?
For me, I was kind of born and raised in it. My great-grandfather got started in muzzleloading. He heard about a muzzleloading shoot here in Indiana over the radio in 1937. And my family's been involved in muzzleloading ever since. But just kind of as I've grown and as I've become more interested in American history and American culture, to me, these are now dubbed antique arms. These are something that in this part of the world is very uniquely American. We have a lot of immigration from Europe coming in that led to the initial design of American firearms. And you have the influence of the French, obviously, in the military aspect. But it really spawned an American legacy, and I think it's something that is uniquely American. You can look everywhere in the world and find cultures and people that are using muzzleloaders. But I'm really super passionate about the American use of those muzzleloaders and how that applies now to American culture in 2022. And then, like you said, how that kind of lays the groundwork for a lot of these legal decisions. It's really not often that muzzleloading is in the news or is used as a legal precedent. So when something like the Bruin decision comes out and we start to see some of the references that are being used in these, firearms law decisions, a lot of them are just dating back to, flintlock muzzleloaders in the early 1700s, as kind of the American colonies began to establish themselves. And I think that's really exciting. And, it's just kind of like we're over here in the corner, sometimes of muzzleloading. I kind of joke that as far as the firearms industry goes, we're kind of the grandpa in the rocking chair. But every now and then we hear our name and we jump up and clap a little bit before sitting back down. So it's just something I'm really excited about and really passionate about.
Yeah, and I do think that it is really important, obviously from that legal perspective, to have a rough understanding of where firearm technology has come from and some of the fundamentals that are there. But even just this new decision talking about 80% lowers and 80% receivers.
Yeah.
That idea can only, or that prohibition, that new rule from the ATF could only be upheld if there was no If there was nothing in the past quite like an 80% receiver, or nowhere in the past had there been handmade, homemade, individually manufactured firearms.
Yeah.
And if you know the history, you are able to make the case that not only has that happened, but that was actually the norm. People buying firearm parts and assembling their own firearms was the way that most firearms came together for a large chunk of time in a large chunk of the country.
Yes, and we even saw that, people think about muzzleloaders a lot, kind of stopping with the Civil War and the advent of breech loading and cartridge guns. But we saw muzzleloaders continue to be used up to and through the Great Depression because of that accessibility. If you had parts, if you had metal, if you had a small forge, you could build one of these muzzleloaders, you could build a firearm and feed your family, which is so crucial in history. I mean, you can go back as far as you want. When we invented firearms, you invented a muzzleloader, and its accessibility through time created, free states, free countries, free people, away from oppressors, and allowed those people to defend, protect, and feed themselves, which is really, really super important in history. We can kind of go through all the battles and the regime changes and kings and things all you want, but at the core, there are people there with muzzleloaders. And I think as it historically goes, things really change once you get into, personal carryable firearms, something that somebody can carry and go out and hunt with individually. You get away from, mass armies and the bows and arrows and things, and you get into kind of, the muzzleloader really started the idea that I can decide my own destiny with this. And then you have, colonization and going into the New World, really expanding on that, but being able to pick up a muzzleloading, really a flintlock rifle, in large sections of history here and go out and make my own life is just wonderful, I think.
Yeah, and there's a lot of different aspects to that. I'm with you. I stick very closely mentally to that American paradigm, and just the timing of flintlock firearms coming along in 1610, and the first American colony 1607, and then Plymouth 1620. Like the timing lines up really, really well. But there is in Europe something that we see that is kind of interesting. Nations in Europe kind of go one or two ways as even before firearms, as weapons technology gets sort of democratized. England does a really good job, for all of its faults, of relying very heavily on citizen defense and civilian militias, to the point that England had a very powerful merchant marine on the high seas that was not a state navy, and they had very powerful archery capability earlier than that, and just were really dependent upon the common man being able to shoot a bow and arrow. And they would take these solid British yeomen over to the continent, and these farmers would just kill their weight in war horses and and French princes in plate armor on a pretty regular basis. Yeah. And other countries shied away from that sort of democratized, privatized defense. But England had a really good track record of that up to a point. Yeah. Even before firearms technology. But firearms technology only amplified that.
Absolutely.
That longbow made a farmer the equal of a nobleman on a war horse in a number of ways. Obviously, in a tactical context, with not on his own, but with help. But pulling a longbow requires an incredible amount of practice and preparation
and sheer strength.
A firearm, and strength. Yeah. What's the saying is something like, if you want to create a longbowman, you begin by training his grandfather.
Yeah. I mean, you talk
the
about
actual
those
requirements for training. It wasn't just that the crown permitted common people to practice with longbows. It actually required Sunday practice because the freedom of the nation depended upon the free men of the nation being able to fight.
And that's so, I don't know. It's just kind of, it's really interesting to me to think about that. Like, you have that moment and that kind of ideology, and then think about everything that happened after that. And it's not the only reason all of that stuff happened, but you can I think you can line that up and say that that is a key reason of a lot of things that happened then moving forward from that point.
Yeah, and the great grandchildren of those guys who fought in Agincourt and some of those other battles, those were the folks who came to America looking for freedom, looking for opportunity, looking for a place to be. They had that presupposition, and firearms made it even easier for small groups of people to be not only self-sufficient in terms of provision, but in terms of defense.
Yes.
So they were standing on the shoulders of their grandfathers in a lot of ways, coming to a new land with a lot of those presuppositions under their belt.
Yeah.
So I find that idea fascinating. And obviously there are other countries that take an opposite approach, and they actually do try to stop commoners from owning weapons. And as a result, when gunpowder shows up on the scene, they take a very different view of what gunpowder should be used for and who should be allowed to have it. But over here in the United States, from the beginning, there just is a tremendous amount of freedom. There aren't really limitations on firearm ownership, even though there are some limitations on things like, where you store powder and things like that in some of these towns and forts.
Yeah. Yeah, you see that what we're talking about with the English longbowmen, you see that directly translated into the early American colonies and the systems set up for firearms ownership and use and maintenance. And, talking about something like powder, I mean, that was in some cases, a very controlled substance because it was so limited once you got here to the the new world, but it was also to keep it safe from some kind of enemy attack. If you could find out where somebody had their powder stored, that was a major issue. So that had to be very well protected for the benefit of that colony.
There's a whole bunch of things. Again, hopefully the video is out and you guys can go watch the video, because the other aspect to a lot of these firearms is they show a tremendous level of craftsmanship and thought. There are ways in which the technology is extremely crude. It is, after all, hundreds of years old, but there is a great elegance to it. It is extremely sophisticated for what it is and what it does. And one of the things that was kind of interesting, as you brought the rifles in and the video guys were setting up lights and cameras and we were laying them out on the table, I think somebody asked, like, is it safe to put them down on the table? Like, this is kind of a rough table. And you were like, oh no, I take these things out in the wood. I drop them on rocks. I shoot deer with them.
Yeah.
It's fine.
That's what they've been doing, man, for hundreds of years.
Yeah. And you brought with you some replicas, but also a lot of original weapons that are very old and have stood the test of time. Yeah. A lot of those flintlocks, they are simultaneously a thing of artistic beauty and craftsmanship, but also just an incredibly rugged, simple device. And maybe it's as I get older and I'm getting into my grouchy old man stage, I have a tremendous appreciation for things that are simple and unbreakable.
Right, yeah.
I definitely love my AR-15 and my 30-round mags and my metallic cartridge lifestyle, but I also love a thing that has pretty much been out in the woods and doing stuff for centuries and still works. And even the design of the flintlock is pretty fascinating in that it was developed around 1610 in France. That was when the flintlock action was perfected. And it was the action for all firearms basically for 2 centuries.
Yeah.
That is an incredibly long amount of time for that technology to be so dominant.
And it was so efficient for the time. I mean, before then you have, if you're unfamiliar with it, before that you have, just kind of the matchlock and the idea of you have a kind of a lit fuse that you're using every time. But that development of the flintlock is just, it's like the advent of the car. It's like a Henry Ford moment for human civilization, because we can think about these, like you said, as being kind of crude and being kind of archaic and 200 years old. But you have to realize that, too, the people that were designing these and making these were skilled craftsmen that had gone through their entire lives, from a very young age, a guild structure of blacksmithing and metalworking and forging to design all these things. And when we think about these being forged and assembled and cast, like you said, in the 1700s, I think I could go out onto the street. I could even go to a muzzleloading event and ask folks today on how to make that with those tools. And most of them wouldn't be able to do it because it's just, we're so far removed from that idea. So while it is still archaic, I should have taken a lock out to show you the internals, but when you pull that lock out and you check out the internals of that lock, it's just mechanical. It's only there to work, but it's still a work of art. Like, it's still elegant. There's no more material anywhere than there absolutely needs to be. And that is something that's just reflected through just about everything when you're in the muzzleloading world, because it's before an age of abundance of material and of ability and of time, really. I mean, you think about these, all of these were made, by window light or by candlelight, with hand tools and things. And I harp on that quite a bit, but it's hard for us today to think about that idea. We can maybe think about a grandfather in their garage shop, or out in a shed somewhere working on something. But this is a whole other step back where we're seeing these being made, and they become, just like everything else from that period, they become an icon of culture from wherever they're being made. So it's not just that they're a functional tool, like an AR-15 is. It's a tool, it's built to go just, you can beat the living daylights out of it and it's still going to go and work. And muzzleloaders are in many ways, but they become a canvas to represent that culture. And I think that's something that people are finding out and really reconnecting with now, at least in the United States here, is these muzzleloaders, especially you can go down to even the region that these were made. So if you're from a county in Pennsylvania, you can identify with the gun builders in your county that were operating in the late 1700s and connect with that minutia of American culture, of your American culture. And that happens everywhere here in the United States just because of the proliferation of those muzzleloaders. And like you say, it's just an elegance and beauty. I mean, here on my monitor here as I'm talking to you, my desktop background is a recreation of an English Ketland lock. And it was an English imported lock, but it's on an iron-mounted Southern gun. And it's just a thing of beauty, and you can go through time and see how those locks change in size, and you can research the who, the how, and the why, and it's all there. It's just a pure representation of culture, I think. It's like a painting. You can see a rifle just like you'd see a painting and think about how it's, the artists that made it, their inspirations, and the regions they came from. It's like a time capsule.
And I think it reflects something that is really easy to overlook. I would say in many ways, we live in kind of a golden age of firearms where there's a lot technologically going on in the gun industry that makes guns really precise, really reliable, and really affordable all at the same time. And we live in a world that doesn't really appreciate guns outside of gun owners. And it's really easy to get this idea that guns are just a thing. For some people, they're just a hobby. For some things, they're just toys. Or maybe guns are just a thing that's a uniquely American expression. You hear commenters on the internet or even commentators on news channels talk about yes, this appreciation for weapons is just this bizarre American thing that the NRA just started a decade ago. And it's super weird. It's like, no. Go back and look at the hundreds of hours that went into creating weapons and how important weapons were to different cultures and how seriously they took them. And you understand that these are a central element of civilizations with different cultural expressions, but these are central elements of civilizations. These are some of the most important tools for building civilizations.
You would be hard-pressed to go to any museum of note in the world and not see specifically a muzzleloader or some kind of early firearm. They're not just going to go from longbows and spears and then jump into, 1930. There's going to be that progression there.
There's, in some ways, a great deal of similarity, even though there's a huge difference, obviously, between a weapon that hundreds of years ago required a master craftsman to spend a huge number of hours on and represented a tremendous amount of wealth and value to own, and an AR-15 today, which is very cheap and simple to make. But there's also some incredible parallels that are there in that AR-15s are very much like the Flintlocks of today.
Yes.
It is a platform that is widespread. Anyone can make them. Hundreds of factories do make them. Thousands of people do make them and can make them. They can be so easily made and repaired on really basic technology, CNC machines and 3D printers. And even though the actual amount of wealth necessary to create an AR-15 is so much smaller than a flintlock, the parallels of a incredibly widespread cottage industry, make it in your own garage sort of weapon that is largely interchangeable and has been a dominant platform for decades. There's a lot of parallels there, and I'm really excited by what that means and what that looks like from an industrial, a cultural, a sort of a civilization-based perspective.
Yeah, when you start thinking about flintlocks and their use, even at a base level, in the 18th century, you still have somebody putting parts together and working with kind of their community of craftspeople, really, to put all of this together, because you had really specialized skills and trades at this point. But it was having a rifle or having some kind of musket, and be that a smoothbore or a rifled barrel here, was necessary in that era. You would have some people that lived in the cities once those started to get established, but you have documentation that shows that this was something that you had to have, and it was something like, I joke about it was something like a phone today. Everybody has a phone. If you jumped in a time machine and went back to the late 18th century, everybody's going to have a rifle of some kind. They're not necessarily going to be carrying it every day, all the time, but it's always going to be there. And it's something that they're going to be proficient with and they're going to be trained for. And they're going to be, they're going to be able to go out and sustain themselves and their family with that rifle if they need to. And you start talking about, the industrial nature of this. By the time we get into the American Revolution and we start, receiving some help from France with the Charleville muskets is kind of the platform that we ended up going with there for a while. Those start to lend themselves, and those are really some of the first things ever with interchangeable parts, both the British Brown Bess and the French muskets, because those countries have been going at war, going at each other for hundreds of years. They had they knew that they needed to make these as efficiently as possible to make all these parts interchangeable. They've been doing this and they knew that. And by the time that gets here, we just kind of take that and run with it. I think we talked about, during the filming a little bit there, that Ford gets a lot of credit for the interchangeability of parts, but that had been done for hundreds of years with muzzleloaders specifically because it had to be done. You had to know that if a guy's lock broke or got busted in a battle, he could drop another lock in there and then start marching the next morning, and it would all work. And it's really a feat, I think, of human ingenuity to think about that era where you don't even have sandpaper. You're in a pre-sandpaper age. You're using forges and files and chisels to make this stuff, and you have interchangeable parts at that era. Now, it's not going to be perfect, but you still have interchangeable parts. And, really just sets off the entire industrial world, really. And when you kind of get here to early America and we start contracting American military arms, which, to geek out a little bit about it, the French Charleville really inspired American military arms. You could argue up through up into the M1 Garand, you can point out similarities between the Charleville used in 1777 and an M1 Garand on just the physicality of it. It's changed a lot, but you can see those resemblances if you look at them side by side. And that interchangeability started there as we start, kind of gearing up for the War of 1812 and the push further west here in the United States. There's just a lot of neat stuff going on there and a lot of industrial advances that were possible only because of, flintlock muzzleloaders and firearms designers and engineers at that time.
This is an area that I want to do more research on because I need to find some more examples. But in the past, firearms have been central not only to societies in their ubiquity culturally, but really have been at the forefront of a lot of industrial development because a firearm is a pretty unforgiving device.
It has to be right.
Its importance requires it to really, it really deserves and receives most of the thought and care. It isn't until you get to like internal combustion engines that you have equipment that is really used as hard and required to be as reliable as firearms were. And so things like when Eli Whitney developed a lot of his more modernized machining capabilities, firearms are really at the forefront of adopting these developments and spurring on a lot of these new developments. And even, that $500 AR-15, which, I mean, in one sense, it is a very far cry from a gorgeous curly maple flintlock that has been made by a craftsman who is truly a master in his field by hand. In one sense, it's the opposite of that, but at the same time, it's pushing a similar envelope. Yes, that AR-15 is a 60-year-old weapon platform, but the reliability that some guy with a CNC machine is getting out of a platform that is now $500, that's pushing an envelope in another way, at a very high level, at that very low price.
And that's a direct extension, I feel, from if you want to train an archer, you have to train his grandfather. The flintlock and everything that it represents is just the grandfather of what we have today. And it will be the great grandfather of the rifles of tomorrow, because it's all there. There's a direct lineage there connecting all of those. And everything has changed, but it's all possible because of that lineage tracking back.
I think that's a good transition to kind of my next thought. So appreciating the past is incredibly valuable. We all need to know our history, and we need to demonstrate an understanding of it for a bunch of reasons. And to understand it also requires you to have a tremendous amount of gratitude for the people that worked so hard to actually build all of these things that we are utilizing today. But, we've had some technological advances. Now we're standing on the shoulders of our grandparents who were giants, and we have AR-15. So who still shoots muzzleloaders? And what are some of the reasons to shoot muzzleloaders beyond just better historical understanding and appreciation?
Well, there's a lot of folks out there that are still shooting muzzleloaders. Like I said, that you had a lot of people feed their families through the American, Great Depression there, and kind of coming through that, you had the rebirth of competitive muzzleloading. I argue that, competitive shooting is America's pastime. Sorry, baseball fans. But we have documentation. It's limited, but we have documentation of some small shooting competitions happening in the late 18th century. And that kind of continues through. But in the early 1900s, I think it was 1929, you had a group of guys get together in southern Ohio, really is kind of the epicenter of this, and started a muzzleloading competition club. And kind of, it's a regional thing, but southern Indiana, Ohio, Kentucky, and Tennessee is home to a really special sect of muzzleloading shooting called chunk shooting. And that was really something that carried muzzleloading through from its obsolescence into the modern era, where it could be picked up kind of by a new generation that had grown up with cartridge arms, whose family had grown up with cartridge arms, but they were looking for something different. And because of those giants in muzzleloading, you have a culture today that still appreciates that, old school shooting sport, and an industry that's around it to support it. It's kind of a cottage industry, really. There's a lot of family-owned businesses out there supporting it, but there are quite a few folks out there shooting with their muzzleloaders, and a large majority of that is folks going out and getting an extra couple weeks for their hunting season with a muzzleloader. But there's kind of been a resurgence here in the last 10 years or so of people interested in enjoying muzzleloaders a little bit more. I kind of attribute that to, the fast-paced lifestyle that we all live, and folks wanting to slow down a little bit. But you have the historical appreciation of muzzleloaders. You have just muzzleloaders and their accoutrements, which is just kind of all the items that go with it. Your horn, your bag, your clothing, your other gear and equipment. We have all of that appreciated as an art form. You have the competition side of it, where you're doing just about everything that folks are doing with modern centerfire firearms, in a competition sense. You have people doing that with muzzleloaders. And then you have your living history, your reenactment side of things too, where people are trying to get a better understanding of history, like you talked about, through living it and going through and creating their own equipment and gear to better connect with, and appreciate what we have today and what our ancestors went through to get us to where we're at today.
To learn a lot of those skills at a more fundamental level, I think that's a really important thing to bring up. So yeah, I definitely know people who shoot muzzleloaders because it gets them an early start on deer season. But I know historical reenactors who do it because it's cool. But I also know historical reenactors who enjoy the challenge of pushing themselves and learning a more basic skill set. And that's something that I have been trying to do for the last year or so. Before smartphones, I used to actually be halfway decent with navigating using a map.
Yeah.
And that is a skill that I completely lost, thanks to Steve Jobs and other people at Google. And I have made it a point to try to get that back. So for the last year, I've been doing a lot more research and experimentation with LandNav and just doing a lot more with maps and less with electronics. And I see a huge amount of value in being able to do both. And I see a lot of folks in the, I guess I would say the Second Amendment community, more of the modern tactical community, who recognize weaknesses with a lot of modern technology or infrastructure, and they would love to get into a little bit more capability, more self-reliance, be less fragile. And a lot of them step down a couple of notches from whatever the current technology is. But I actually really like the idea of stepping back very far and learning the fundamentals and then working your way back up. So really simple stuff.
Yeah, I think that's a really great thing for people to play with and experiment with. I mean, it's, I guess to paint it with a broad brush, everything that you see people doing, like I said, with the competition when it comes to shooting muzzleloaders and things, everything that you see people doing with modern survival and rucking and recce, you can do all of that with 200-year-old equipment. And there's a large group of us out here that specifically love doing that. So I have a modern trekking bag where I can go out and camp with my family or go meet up with some folks out in the woods somewhere. And I have all the modern amenities that I can carry on my back and haul into the woods. But then I have a direct replication of that for the 18th century that is all dirt simple equipment. I mean, it's all canvas, it's leather, it's linen, it's wool, and that's it. And being able to go out there and just camp out for a night and feed yourself is one thing with your modern equipment. And I encourage anybody out there to do it. But when you're going out there and you have your flintlock, you have your knapsack on your back, you've got your wool hat on and your frock coat, and you're going out there sitting under the stars, laying on top of a wool blanket, it just brings a whole other perspective to it. And being able to do it with, nothing in comparison to what we have today is just an incredible feeling, I think, just for folks interested in becoming less dependent on modern technology. I'm not saying throw it away by any means. Absolutely use it and know how to use it. But getting out there and starting a fire with flint and steel, you can't beat that. You can, if you have a good steel and you live near a creek of some kind, odds are you can find a piece of flint and start a fire and make some clean water and feed yourself. And I bring this a lot back to, connecting with history. And I don't mean that in kind of a nerd historian sense, I guess. Not that there's anything wrong with that. But for me, it's really culturally important. We talk a lot in contemporary times about American culture, and people think the 1950s, cars, white picket fence, barbecue. But for me, really, the American culture goes back that step further, and it's that self-reliant attitude of being able to know that I can start a fire. As simple as that is, I would bet you $1 million that a 7-year-old from 1780 can start a fire, shoot a squirrel, shoot a rabbit, clean it, cook it, and be in bed before you've got your fire started, today.
Yeah.
And I don't really care what tools you're using. You can have the most modern tools, and I'd bet you that 7-year-old from 1780 can just about beat you because of the proficiency that they had to have with those tools to make it work and to get you to where you are today. It's just really...
It's kind of fascinating to me when you read, there are multiple accounts of children whose parents died on the Oregon Trail and were separated from wagon trains, and young children were able to survive and keep their wagon moving and keep the oxen moving and take care of one another and make it back to a wagon train or make it to a town and survive. And yeah, those were brutal times. I certainly don't have a desire to go back to that level, but I do see a lot of value in understanding those skills. And so one of the things that we've been doing with our kids, we're a little older. I think we're a little bit ahead of you. But we have been reading pioneer stories to them, and I really do see some value rather than teaching my kids how to navigate with a phone and then take a step back and how to navigate with a GPS and then take a step back and how to navigate with a map. Start at the fundamentals and then work up from there.
That's a really great thing about everything that we're talking about, both the equipment and the firearms in general. I grew up really only knowing that muzzleloaders were the only guns for many years. It wasn't until I was 6 or 7, I think, and shooting a .22 for the first time that I realized that I could shoot and then not need to reload. Which is really simple as a kid, but as I go back and think about that, and as I talk to more people in muzzleloading, it's a really great way to learn because it is slow. Because as a child, you have to kind of understand that process, and it's a much more intimate way to learn how to shoot. And then, kind of as you grow up and as you become an adult and you become more familiar with other firearms, if you can shoot well with a flintlock, I tell people, you can shoot anything. Because that is hard mode. And if you can kind of go through that simplistic process, in comparison to a lot of things today, and whether that's with shooting or fire starting or stitching up a hole in your clothes or something and getting that going or plant identification, anything like that, starting with kind of, the way it used to be and working your way up, you're not only learning simple and becoming more advanced, but you're learning the way that humans have and that people have. And I think, or I hope at least, that people can kind of look back and associate that and understand their ancestors a little bit. I don't mean to harp on that too much, but it's something that gets me excited.
I thought of a similar parallel, which, again, this episode is just going to be me sounding like I'm a Luddite. But in the olden days of teaching videography and photography, back when film and videotape was expensive,
yep.
One of the first things you learned was to be very deliberate and very careful before you wasted the very expensive 24 exposures that you had in your camera. And now a digital camera is just like, I'll take 6,000 photos and one of them will by accident be good. And ta-da, I'm a photographer now.
Yeah.
I think there are a lot of parallels, I'm sure, for a lot of different things where the new tools come along. They offer tremendous capability over the old tools. But the old tools were unforgiving and forced you to be deliberate and to be careful and to be involved in the process. That's one of the things that is really interesting to me about muzzleloading. And we've talked about this prior to this. I've never shot a muzzleloader, but just handling the muzzleloaders and talking to you, I've decided that we really should have one. I'm not sure exactly the timetable. I'm very excited about and I want to build a muzzleloader. And I want to go all the way to flintlock just because might as well go all the way. And I'm very excited about shooting that and learning more about it. And then the other thing that I learned as I was reading about muzzleloading shooting competitions, I already knew this, but I kind of forgot. Muzzleloaders are extremely powerful.
Oh, yeah.
And they have tremendous ballistic capability. And I knew that because obviously they were used for significantly effective bloody combat and even super long range shooting. There is a local legend here in Middle Tennessee named Jack Hinson, who was a Confederate sniper, kind of a freelance Confederate sniper.
Yeah.
And he pulled off some extremely long shots and focused his attention on Union officers. But it should come as no surprise to people who are listening and have their brains engaged, like I didn't, that people who are doing long-range muzzleloading competitions are shooting 1,000 yards and further. They're doing stuff that long-range guys are doing with modern cartridges. And I guess those bullets are maybe not as aerodynamic. They don't have quite the same ballistic coefficient that some of our really nice, 6.5 Creedmoor does, for example.
Yeah.
But hey, a 400 grain bullet is gonna have some momentum. It's gonna go.
That is going to hurt. I don't care where you're standing.
Black powder is not the fastest powder out there, but if you have a 30-inch barrel and you're shooting a 400 grain bullet, you can send that thing about as far as you can see all day.
Yeah. And that kind of goes into something else that we've kind of talked about here a little bit, but the efficiency and the simplicity of it. I mean, these things, especially going back to the flintlock, if you lost your flint, you could find and hopefully knap together and cob together a rough flint to get you going again. If that came out of the jaws, you could get that going again. Black powder is manufacturable with natural materials that you can find. I mean, we did have industries set up, even going back to the early colonies, to handle all this stuff and to bring it in and to support and make it. But it is the kind of stuff that is something that you can actually work on. I mean, you can build a muzzleloader. This past weekend, met half a dozen people that at an event that brought their own muzzleloaders that they had made in their home shops and wanted me to see them because they were just proud of them. And they should be proud, because that's that tradition there. And that's the kind of thing that, even with a lack of, you don't have to be an engineer, you don't have to be a mechanical engineer to figure a lot of this stuff out. If you study this and have a little bit of equipment, you can make something work here, which is, goes back to that, talking about the polymer 80 frames and things, the 80% lowers and that kind of stuff. It's the kind of thing that you were expected to be able to maintain and keep going because of that simplicity. And that carries through to today. You have something that's marginally effective compared to what we have today, but is a lot more sustainable on the individual level.
That is fascinating to me. And it also has some practical application. A couple years ago, when ammo was really, really expensive, I happened to mention to our mutual friend Jordan, like, I haven't been shooting recently, ammo's too expensive. And he was like, oh, I hadn't really noticed.
Yep.
I still have 600 pounds of wheel weights and 1,000 pounds of linotype, and I am not going to buy... I'm making my own bullets, and I hadn't noticed that anything had changed.
Yep. Yeah, we talk about starting fires and boiling water and cooking food and things, but there's also that side of it. Just like if you're interested in reloading your modern cartridges, there's a whole other world out there for developing a load and a projectile for your muzzleloader. And each and every muzzleloader is a little bit different, even with the modern machining standards. We always kind of joke that you can ask 10 people an opinion on a load for a muzzleloader, or how to clean a muzzleloader, just about anything with muzzleloading, and you're going to get 12 different answers out of them, because there's not a lot of specifics with it, and there's just kind of a lot of you practicing and trying it out. And with that comes a lot of experimentation and a lot of self-reliance, because it's up to you to figure that out. And that kind of by extension translates into finding the right powder, and then finding the right projectile for your muzzleloader, and kind of leads into having several hundred pounds of lead just sitting on your farm somewhere so that you can melt it down and spend a few evenings playing with hot lead and figuring out what works.
I went on a small rabbit trail several months ago and looked into bullet production, and I never came up with a great solution for rifle bullets, because for modern firearms, they don't enjoy shooting just raw lead. Mm-hmm. They really want some kind of coating, some kind of plating. And for pistol bullets, powder coating works really well. But if you want any kind of rifle accuracy, that's a little bit of a harder nut to crack. So I didn't come up with a really solid self-reliance plan for my 300 Blackout or my 5.56 AR-15. But Jordan was laughing at me. He's like, "No, I can cast bullets for the rest of my life."
Yep.
shoot an awful long ways with my Winchester.
If you're friends with a roofer or a plumber, you can just about always find some lead to keep yourself shooting through just about anything. I mean, that was the interesting thing, kind of, through the ammo shortage and all the supply chain issues. We talked about this a little in person, but black powder became a little bit hard to come by, and still is in some regards. And percussion caps for kind of the step after your flintlock muzzleloaders are still difficult to find, primarily because primer production is dedicated to centerfire cartridges, which makes sense. But I joked with you, while we were filming there, that there were people out there trying to figure out how to make their own black powder, but they didn't know how to grow a tomato. But that's kind of the level of self-reliance that you can get to with this stuff, like I said, because of that simplistic nature. And I don't mean to repeat myself, but...
Yeah. Oh, well, other people didn't hear that joke. But
right.
Yeah, it's worth bringing up again. Hopefully, this becomes, as you get into an aspect of muzzleloading, say, or some other hobby or land navigation or something where you take a step back or out of your comfort zone, hopefully that broadens your horizons in a lot of areas.
Yes.
And you realize, like, oh, fresh water, that's going to be important. Oh, I'm going to need to learn how to grow a tomato. I'm going to die of starvation before I run out of black powder. I'll address that first.
Yeah.
Having that larger understanding of things is, I think, really important. Which is why I think that our T-Rex community, or the larger Second Amendment community, and the muzzleloading community actually have a lot of overlap and should be learning a lot from each other. In the same way that the tactical community has learned to do stuff with the airsofting community. I think that would be a really neat and fruitful thing.
Oh yeah.
How big is the muzzleloading community, if you had to guess?
That's hard to say. I'm not really great with numbers. You can go to a place like Pennsylvania; it just seems like it's everywhere. You can go to a place like Colorado, and it's much more focused on the hunting side of it. I'm trying to think.
But there are conventions.
Oh yeah, I mean there are
all kinds of events, and
just this
thousands and thousands of people who are into different aspects of it as a hobby or a lifestyle or an interest or a career in these small family businesses that are doing all aspects of production and repair and manufacturing.
Yeah, I think that there were some numbers released on just hunting specifically, that there are several factors over 1 million of people that shoot and enjoy muzzleloaders. Just this.
Oh, wow. Okay.
This few.
I would have expected 100,000, 200,000. That's way more popular than I thought.
It's really weighted because of the hunting, and there are, I'm not discounting anybody, as being. I want everybody that wants to be involved in muzzleloading to be involved in as much as they want to be. I mean, for me, it's like my thing. I live, eat, and breathe it. But if it's just something where you get out your rifle and you sight it in and then you go hunt, more power to you. And I'm happy that you're enjoying your muzzleloader in that capacity. But just like I'm more familiar with the eastern side of the country because that's where I'm at. But just from July through November, really, just about every weekend there is an event that I know of on the eastern side of the Mississippi. There are quite a few events dotted out west. I just can't speak with any authority on those. But going back to the early muzzleloading clubs that got started in the 1920s and the 1930s, many of those clubs still exist, and they are kind of the backbone of this sport and this community because they kept it going, and they became locations where you could foster these events and get groups of people together. And a lot of those events have outgrown, those clubs and become, partnerships with different muzzleloading organizations, in the country and in those specific areas. But there's something to do with muzzleloading just about every weekend out there if you're interested in it. And I encourage you I mentioned the muzzleloading clubs because that's a great place to find a place with people that are interested in sharing knowledge and can point you in the right direction to an event or to a competition or to just a backyards, somebody's woods camp and trek kind of thing. Look up one of those clubs and start asking around about muzzleloaders, and odds are you're going to find somebody and a group of people out there that are doing this and want to help you get involved.
One of the things that I have been really encouraged by, it's been really fun to watch, is in our community, the trend has moved a little bit away from door kicking and CQB and over to sustainment and more like light infantry stuff, which I think is really good and healthy. And those are important, valuable skills, and working together as a group, which is also great for any community. But you muzzleloaders and reenactors to a large extent have been doing this for a long time and have a lot of stuff figured out. I actually had this is a long time ago. I had a tremendous experience with some friends who were reenactors. And we put on a bunch of paratrooper gear, World War II paratrooper gear, and had N1 Garands. And we went out into a park. And we were doing different types of movements through this park. And we got seen because, there's a lot of people out there.
Yeah.
But because we were in historical garb, it was fine. Even though this was in New England, nobody was like, oh my goodness, a violent militia group. It was like, oh yeah, reenactors out there. It's historical. It's fine. It's totally okay for there to be a group of guys with M1 Garands doing actual phase line movements and dangerous training on this government park. So all kinds of opportunities open up to do things in places that would otherwise be closed off to you with your modern equipment.
Yeah. Except for New York right now. It's kind of a segue here, but it's something that's just happened this week. Their new concealed carry law that went into effect this month doesn't leave any exemption for muzzleloaders at these sensitive locations that the governor has set up. So a lot of the historic sites and the museums and the places that have hosted these living history reenactments for decades are now having reenactors, not want to risk getting a felony is how it's described. So that's something that's kind of unfolding right now. It's not something that, I like to hear about muzzleloaders in the news about, but that is an issue that, muzzleloading enthusiasts are facing in New York, which, I could go on and on about how I feel about the law in general, but it is affecting 200-year-old technology, which is kind of crazy.
Yeah, New York is interesting. I found out pretty recently that one of the really early American long-range shooting clubs was actually in New York. The NRA actually had the Creedmoor shooting area. And I don't know much about it except that it was on Long Island. So not that long ago, the place where you would go do the highest level of long-range shooting, international long-range shooting competitions, was in Queens.
Was born in New York, And it was international competition. I mean, for years, it was the Americans versus the Irish on figuring out who was the better shot. I mean, the history alone of the Creedmoor matches is just a whole other avenue to go down, because you have really the advent of long range shooting in a competition sense, and everything that comes with it, with the advances of technology. I mean, when it comes to muzzleloading, I joke that I call them race guns, I guess, just like you would in a modern competition. But you have race gun muzzleloaders being developed, and everybody's trying to get the fastest, most accurate muzzleloader as possible. And for years, that's what my grandfather and my father did. But that history of trying to get the most out of your muzzleloader goes back to the Creedmoor matches. That's really an iconic, very well documented series of events for you to check out. It's just kind of, how accurate can we be, because we have to beat those jerks across the pond again. We just have to do it again, and we're going to figure it out. I don't know that they ultimately did or not. I can't recall off the top of my head, but really neat intersection
who won the final match.
Exactly. Really neat intersection of muzzleloading, engineering, and sport in that moment in history. And you had crowds, you had bleachers set up to watch the matches. I mean, it was just something else.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine now, seeing New York the way that it is, that was the spot. People would come out and watch long-range rifle shooting in the middle of Queens.
Yeah. Well, if you go back and you look at things like the World's Fair, firearms technology, especially Colt, kind of the icon of it, firearms technology was displayed and had its own section at the World's Fair for years because of how important it was to manufacturing in general. I mean, they saw that it was culturally there, and it was celebrated for years.
Yeah, and I think an understanding of this is really, really important, because it's something that is not being taught, and being able to talk about the Second Amendment or just firearms and weapons in general requires that we have a better historical understanding of how central that was to technology and all aspects of civilization. So I have a question for you.
Yeah.
How familiar are you with the term gun culture 1.0, 2.0, 3.0? Are these terms that you've heard bandied about on the internet?
Yes, I'm actually trying to develop muzzleloading culture 1.0, 2.0, and 3.0. So I've been kind of studying those a little bit.
Okay. So my theory is that it shouldn't necessarily revolve around equipment, but mentality, because there are people out there. It's easy to just say, well, gun culture 3.0 is when you get your rifle plates and your night vision. And I really liked that. I really liked that convention. But I think that it really is larger. It is important to have a larger understanding of that. And so what I'm currently kind of thinking is gun culture 1.0 is when you enjoy the hobby aspect of it. And gun culture 2.0 is when you actually are prepared to use your firearm as a weapon to defend yourself. And then gun culture 3.0 is when you have an idea for more public defense. Gun culture 2.0 is personal defense, and then gun culture 3.0 is more public defense, when you are more community minded and more organized and more capable. That I think that is a little bit better definition, because if it's too equipment related, then you would say like, yes, well, the militia that actually beat the British at Lexington and Concord, they were gun culture 1.0 because they didn't have certain military technology.
Yeah.
But they were clearly gun culture 3.0 guys.
Yeah.
And this is something that I really think that our T-Rex Arms community, I think this is a helpful paradigm for us to think through. And so, yeah, I'd love to know what your thoughts are about muzzleloading gun culture of these different levels.
Well, I guess just to carry on a little bit there with what you're talking about, I mean, I fully agree with the mentality side of it and how you're thinking about it. To connect it a little bit with muzzleloading, when we go back to some of the documentation of some of those early colonies and communities, it was mandatory that, once you became 16, you had your musket, you could make cartridges, you had a supply of powder, and you carried a knife and a tomahawk, and you had to be ready to defend the fort that you were living in or defend the farmer that was outside the fort. And you had to be proficient in that from the age of I think it was, in general, it was like 16 to 45 or 50. So that culture and that 3.0 that you're talking about, I mean, that goes back and is documented as a requirement culturally for those American people. And even in communities where it wasn't necessarily outlined in the legal proceeding of the community that they were living under, a lot of times, it was under like a business or a corporation from the time. When you see people stretch out on their own independently, again, you see them maintaining those same standards because of how important and how crucial that was. I guess for muzzleloading, talking about kind of those tiers, I think it all works in that same mindset. For muzzleloading, are you wanting to know what muzzleloading 1.0 is and 2.0 or am I misinterpreting it?
I was just thinking what your thoughts were, as you mentioned you've been trying to develop this concept for this community.
Well, I think that you kind of many more people get interested in and introduced to muzzleloading just through hunting than I think I ever imagined until recent years. I'll admit I'm not a super active hunter. And for me, muzzleloading has always been kind of accuracy and that kind of focus. But I would guess I would kind of see that as kind of 1.0 is you've got a muzzleloader, you've probably got a Hawken, you go out and shoot a little bit at the range, and it's kind of an oddity in your collection. And then, probably 2.0 is you're interested in, something maybe a little more historically appropriate for your area, or you have a certain niche that you're interested in. If you're interested in like a Kentucky or a Pennsylvania long rifle or a Southern mountain rifle or the military side of it, you're starting to research, people that you're interested in and what they were using. And then I imagine 3.0 is you're kind of like where I'm at, where you have a little bit of a variety of these different arms, and you're catching up some of the other equipment. each muzzleloader for many of us has its own set of gear that's appropriate for that muzzleloader for its location. So every rifle has its own bag, its own horn, its own set of tools to accompany that, so that I can, just like my ancestors would have, I can grab that rifle and I can grab that bag and I can go out and hunt a squirrel or something, depending on what I'm doing that day. It can be much more severe depending on where you're at, on the frontier, but kind of wanting to get into that mindset, just like you're talking about with, you're building a community. We have that same thing in muzzleloading. I mean, a bunch of friends, each spring and fall, I go down to a camp by a creek, and you're dressed in the period clothes, you're carrying a period rifle. There's a little bit of a shooting match, and you're, hanging out, and there's tons of period, hunting camps out there in the country where everybody's dressed up and they're hiking in to an area in period gear, and they're spending that week or that weekend in period gear, and they might be hunting, or they might just be, going along and cutting a trail through the woods, going out and doing that. So it's kind of on a scale of how uncomfortable you want to be. We like to joke.
Yeah. That's good.
Yeah. And that really translates, I think, to a lot of the stuff that I see online, and a lot of the stuff that everybody's, myself included, doing with their modern equipment is, you can have this, I have everything and I can carry everything mindset. And then once you've kind of done that for a while, you start to take that stuff away. And, well, can I get away with not having this? Can I get away with not having that? And then you get in the mindset of, well, I'm having my, my wood framed knapsack from the 18th century, and I'm going to see what I can get away with having, having a kettle and having a fire kit, having a wool blanket, and having a rifle. If you can go out and live, fairly comfortably for a few days with that, you can do just about anything. And that's what a lot of friends are getting into the mindset of doing, where, we've gone hunting, we've done the competition side of things, we're interested in the history, and now we're going out and, seeing how miserable we can tolerate being. I don't want to, plug a lot of people on your show or anything, but my friend Nathaniel Kilbuck has a blog called The Buffalo Trace 1765. And he's one of those guys that's going out there and reading original documentation of how uncomfortable sometimes these people had to live to survive, and then going out and sometimes intentionally, most times not intentionally, becoming that uncomfortable in a trek or in a hike, setting out on a 24-mile hike and not realizing until the night that you've stopped for the first time, you're drenched from it's been raining all day, you're wearing moccasins, your pack is soaked because it's not waterproof, and you realize that your rice, coffee, and flour has all gotten mixed up in your pack because you were so focused on getting through the rain that it all mixes up, and then that's your food for the week. That's what you have, and you have to go and deal with that, and that story is just incredible. I'm just paraphrasing it, but that's like 3.0, 4.0 for me is and associated with that is like extreme, really focused in on the competition where you're punching, quarter-sized groups with a variety of muzzleloaders at a variety of distances, trying to be as good as you can. It's not all about the historic recreation. It's just kind of a level of how passionate, how serious you are with it. And there's a bunch of those degrees. I hope that wasn't rambling too much for you.
Oh, well, that's fascinating. It reminded me of a story that Grand Thumb told me. He used to be a SEER instructor, so he would take people out into the wilderness for various types of training. And at one point, a group of guys that he had out in the wilderness realized that a woodsman with a flintlock rifle had been following them and messing with their camp for days. And they had no clue that he had been there. And then finally, because these are pretty high-level military dudes that he's working with, they do manage to catch sight of him. And then they chase him, and he gets away.
They catch sight of him.
He is so at home in the woods that, so Mike said, like, I was so impressed by that guy. I was like, I need to learn how to do this stuff.
And it's about...
And one of his comments was like, I don't want to be able to just survive in the wilderness. I want to be able to rebuild civilization if necessary.
Yeah. And I love, I'm not like I don't love the, thinking about having to do that, because that's going to be a very tough thing in any of that situation.
Yeah.
And not to say that anybody does, but going back and reading the historic accounts from the 18th and early 19th century here, we can see people doing that, in a well-documented, they speak the same language. We have their artifacts, we have their equipment, we know their locations, and we can see almost their daily life in instances trying to do that here in a foreign land. You have animals, you have, issues with the native people, you have issues with your own people, going through all of that with very primitive technology, but they're still people, they're still humans, and they still go through a lot of the same things that we do today. I just finished a book about Simon Girty, who was kind of a frontier legend. Some people call him kind of one of America's first villains because of his associations during the French and Indian and later the late French and Indian, really, and then the American Revolution. But he crossed paths with Colonel Crawford in Ohio, and Girty was partnered with a series of native tribes here, didn't take kindly to European incursion into land, and ended up torturing Crawford and burning him at the stake. But there was a story about the doctor that was with Crawford on his expedition, and Girty and some of the natives tied him up to be taken around to another camp. And I'm paraphrasing here, but the one native was charged with taking him to the next village over for him to have to, to run a gauntlet and be punished. The doctor, he's not a woodsman. He's not, a long hunter. He's not used to being out alone in the woods or anything. He ends up getting the guy transporting him to untie his wrists so he could swat the bugs. The bugs are so bad in the woods. His captor feels bad for him, unties his wrists so he can swat the bugs off of his face because he's naked. He's painted black and he's naked. Guy ends up, his captor goes off to find a little bit of firewood. He's charged with finding some kindling to get a fire started. While that's happening, he knocks his captor to the ground, goes for his rifle, tries to shoot him. It's busted. The rifle's broken. They both set off in different directions into totally native, totally virgin forest. You're thinking a late 1700s eastern forest here. I mean, it's totally different than anything we have today. And the guy survives in the woods with nothing for 21 days before he finds a settlement on the horizon that's friendly.
Wow.
And I mean, he's a scholarly guy. He's a doctor. He's not meant to be out there. It's not something he's ever done in his life. But reading that really gave me a new perspective on what do I need to be able to do, just as a person, as an American, because I could not do that with nothing. Yeah. Naked, running through the woods.
Mental toughness.
Exactly. That mental fortitude.
Let alone the skills.
Yes. And I think, to bring it back to the culture and the tiers of that culture, I think that is, somewhere in that scale. And that kind of brings it back to, it's not about that equipment. It's not about what you have. Mm-hmm. Because, I mean, he writes in his journal when he gets back and he tells his story just about seeing his captor behind every bush. I mean, it wasn't like he knew he was free and he knew he was out. In his mind, his captor was always there, and that captor knew the woods better than he ever would, and he was constantly on his tail. And he was able to have the fortitude to go back to civilization, let alone find it, and resume normal life. And I think stories like that really bring the modern preparedness and civilian mindset that I think that we're getting into in firearms culture, and bring it back to history without it being, knowing dates and names, kind of like we're taught in history class growing up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I see a huge amount of value in that, having that context and that perspective. And, as a dad and a husband and someone who's in a relatively small community, like just thinking about my own weaknesses and things that I want to be capable of doing in an emergency.
Yeah.
A better understanding of the world that they lived in is a way better preparation for the world that you are living in than we probably would like to admit.
Yeah. But I think it's optimistic. I mean, as rough as a lot of these stories are, we're still here because of those people. They endured it. And for me, no matter how, I mean, Colonel Crawford really suffered a terrible end, but he lived through quite a bit of it. And, the people that were there, just around the world at that time, they endured all of that. They endured some really rough situations. And to me, that's kind of the silver lining. As I read these documents and go through these journals of people that lived it, it brings a totally different mindset now that I have a daughter and I have a wife and I have a family than it did when I was 12, kind of thinking about these people as, frontier superheroes, really. It's that totally different mindset, but it's understanding that that's something that can happen, and this is how you can get through it. And this is something to really think about, I think, on how to get familiar with it.
Well, that's not actually a rabbit trail that I thought we were going to go down, but I'm really glad that we did that, because I think that is something that is really fascinating and important, and that is a thread that I think does really connect a lot of folks in the modern firearms community with folks in the muzzleloading community. I think that there's actually quite a bit of overlap and a lot of really good, there could be a lot of really good collaboration with a bunch of folks that we have as mutual friends. And if somebody listening to this podcast wanted to get involved in some of these events or learn more about them, I know right off the bat, your podcast, you have a number of guests on there. So going to ilovemuzzleloading.com would be a great place to start learning about some of these things. But what are some of the other resources that people should look into?
I always recommend, if you're just really wanting to get started, I mean, obviously the internet is full of a lot of free and useful tools. Because muzzleloading can get a little complicated, you're going to wade through a lot of conversations just about what should be or shouldn't be. Generally, as long as you're doing things safely and paying attention to safety, you're really not going to be able to hurt yourself. From there are a ton of great books that have been published over the years about muzzleloading. Sadly, not a lot of them are in print. And when I say about muzzleloading, I mean every aspect that we've talked about here tonight. Whether you're interested in the competition or hunting or recreation or living history, any side of that, there's tons of books out there. Check out some of the secondhand bookstores that are out there online. Eric Sloan, Mark Baker are some really big authors for you to start and learning and checking out. They're going to kind of lead you into some of the other authors by nature, just by what they were writing about. Going from there, the National Muzzleloading Rifle Association, not associated with the NRA, has a collection of charter clubs around the country, and they actually have a directory of these clubs and their contact information at nmlra.org, where you can find a local club in your area. And I really encourage you to try to find some folks in your area because a lot of this stuff is going to feel easier or more comfortable to learn with a mentor. And that mentor in muzzleloading, we love sharing this stuff. It's a part of what we do and why we do it is sharing it and sharing the history and sharing that knowledge. So try to find a club, try to find a group in your area. There are going to be a lot of non-affiliated muzzleloading clubs out there that aren't affiliated with the national organization. But that's just a good place to start looking and start kind of getting a groundwork for some place that you can go. Also, with the national organization, they have a list of field reps that are muzzleloading representatives around the country with their contact information at that same website. So I encourage you to try to find a club or somebody in your area and reach out to them and talk to them. I'm more than happy if you want to get in contact with me to try to point you in the right direction. Like I said, I'm more familiar with the eastern side of the United States. But from there are a few magazines that are published through the year, Muzzleloader Magazine and Muzzle Blasts Magazine. My website, obviously, I try to interview and share a lot of muzzleloading news and things. I really just kind of keep that as an open door, though, for your questions. I spend most of my time answering muzzleloading questions and trying to point people to people that know more than I do about it. And I really love doing that. So it might take me a little bit to get back with you, but I really do try my best to get with everybody. muzzleloading can feel kind of expensive to get started in, but Traditions, I'm not sponsored or anything by them, builds a really nice introductory muzzleloader that you can get as a kit or a finished. It's a percussion half stock rifle. You can get a flintlock version of it as well for a little bit more. For right around $400, you can get yourself a rifle. And then I always recommend, about another $100 on top of whatever muzzleloader you do choose to start with, to get some powder and some projectiles and, like a bag or something to carry it in. And from there, you can kind of really expand on that as much as you want. I mean, I'm very fortunate. I'm able to invest a little bit of money in my equipment, and a lot of my stuff is handmade and made personally by artists in the community, which is really a lot of fun because you can go to an event and get a lot of inspiration because nobody's gear is alike. You might have you could set aside, 6 rifles by the same maker or 6 bags by the same maker, and they're all going to be a little bit different just because of the nature of the sport. But you can kind of go through those tiers, culture 1.0 to 3.0 as fast as you want. And there's something out there for everybody in muzzleloading.
Well, I've been thinking a number of times I've had conversations with T-Rex folks, and a pretty common question, I get a lot of radio questions, but a pretty common question after that is, where do I find like-minded people? And I would not be surprised if a lot of T-Rex folks would find like-minded people in this other community, even if the equipment looks fairly different.
Absolutely.
So hopefully that is a really interesting place to meet people and do some collaboration.
9 out of 10 muzzleloading enthusiasts are going to have everything that a modern prepared civilian should have.
Yeah.
I think you'll hit it off if you can find some of those people. They're out there. I promise you. It's not just old stuff. We're not FUDs.
I mean, this is actually kind of a hilarious thing. If you lean hard enough into historical equipment, you don't become a FUD. You go all the way around and come out as an the opposite of a FUD. You come out a pretty hardcore, heavily based dude.
Yeah, it's independence really runs pretty strong through this group.
Very good. Well, thank you so much for this conversation, Ethan. I really appreciate it. Hopefully, this is just a really neat area to explore for folks. I have really enjoyed our conversations, and thanks again so much for coming down and visiting and helping us shoot that video that I assume by now most of the people listening to the podcast have actually hit pause and watched the video, but if not, go check out the video. Again, I really hope it's up by now, but that's a video that I think will be helpful for folks, and having your equipment there was a huge part of the shoot, and I really enjoyed it. Like I said before, I kind of need a flintlock now.
Yeah.
I've always thought they were really neat, but just holding some of these old rifles made me realize I really need a flintlock. I can't really explain it. I just kind of need one.
That's the American in you crying out. I mean, I really can't thank you enough for the opportunity. It was a great time, and really, as we started to take the rifles out of their cases, and your film crew there, they're seeing their faces light up like a kid on Christmas. This really was really wonderful. That really just made the entire trip for me. Any opportunity I have to see that face on a group of folks it's an opportunity I'm going to take, and I can't thank you enough for the invitation.
Now, there's one rifle that was on the table that we didn't talk about in the video because it's kind of its own rabbit trail, but special Easter egg for people who watch the video and notice it on the table. So let's talk about the Whitworth rifle for just a second.
Yeah. So that is a Parker Hale reproduction of an English Whitworth rifle. I mean, Whitworth rifles are kind of legendary. They're seen as some of the first sniper rifles used in the American Civil War. Their actual documented use is fairly limited in comparison to the legend that has been built up around them. But they are just one of those moments in, I think, industrial and firearms history where you hit a point where everything kind of changes. I mean, there are stories of trained Confederate soldiers and marksmen, which before they got into, the war and the military, they were trained and prepared civilians themselves. It wasn't the gun that made this possible for them. It extended their reach, but they had to be good shots themselves. But I've read a few books about Confederate soldiers who are able to just stack up Union supply lines with a Whitworth rifle across a ridge in the American South by just stacking up their mules where they couldn't pull wagons through a trail in the mountains. I mean, the Whitworth rifle is just kind of a legendary rifle, but it's sad because the ingenuity of it in Europe and in England where it was made just wasn't realized. It was just kind of seen as an oddity, much like the Ferguson rifle, 100 years earlier. You had the technological advancement kind of changed how we could do things, and it wasn't really realized for quite a while after that. Famously, they have a hexagonal bore and a hexagonal bullet mold that was designed to match 1-to-1. So you had a bore riding bullet in that hexagonal rifle twist, but really didn't. In tests, both when it was made and then in modern days, you don't see a lot more efficiency out of that hexagonal bullet. You see a lot of people doing very well with them, with more of a traditional lead conical bullet. And then, and that kind of ties into some of those Creedmoor matches. That technology and that thought process extended then into those Creedmoor matches. And it was kind of the grandfather of long range shooting. But it was a muzzleloader. Muzzleloaders have been doing everything, for a while.
Well, you mentioned this idea that muzzleloaders in many ways should be more accurate because you index the bullet into the rifling twice.
Yes.
And that's something I'd not thought about before. Obviously, there's a lot of factors that go into accuracy and precision besides simply rifling engagement. But
yeah, you have a lot more control over your components. Even more so. I mean, it's on the same level as modern reloading, but it was Pope who, even up into the cartridge era and the single shot era, I believe until his death, he was still writing about believing that indexing the projectile through the muzzle was the way to get the most accurate shot out of a rifle. And you see that even in modern single shot rifle matches with the American Single Shot Rifle Association. There's still folks out there that will index through the muzzle, kind of carrying on that tradition that of Pope and muzzleloading before him.
Fascinating stuff. That is, I think, a great end to the episode. For those of you that watched the video and you recognize the rifle on the table, the one rifle that I didn't pick up in the video, it was too cool not to have on the table, even though there wasn't time. As you said, it's a fascinating technological advancement that doesn't actually lead anywhere. So it didn't get mentioned in the video for that reason, but it was too cool not to have on the table. So now it had to be mentioned in the podcast.
Yeah. Well, thank you for giving the Whitworth a moment to shine.
Well, thanks again, Ethan. I'm looking forward to the next time that you visit, the next time that we talk. And thank you so much for being on the podcast. And those of you who are interested, head over to I Love Muzzleloading listening. There's a lot more podcasts with Ethan there and other guests who are knowledgeable about this subject. So that should be a really fun thing for some of you guys to look into. And again, possibly an opportunity to find some more like-minded folks and really get into some of these deeper fundamental foundational skills that I think are really important.